Today, in this video, I'm going to show you how to combine watercolours, ink, and watercolour pencils and Posca pens, and just show you the different possibilities for incorporating these kind of different media together. It's still a line and wash or ink and watercolour sketch, but we can get extra textures, extra punch, extra sort of bits of magic, and also just more fun and exploration from trying a few different things. I'm using a different palette today, different watercolours. I recently did a video, which you can find here, about the toxicities in some watercolours, and make up your mind about what's important to you and the environment. But for me, that resulted in me changing my palette around a bit. You can find a video here and also on SKILLSHARE where I go in depth into how I recreated my palette from the first principles of primary colours and paired primaries and things like that. But today is the first video where I'm actually going to use it. And what it is it's a really vibrant palette. It's the first big upgrade I've done for a couple of years. So I'm really excited to share that with you as well. Without further ado, let's just start sketching. You can find the reference photo in the description below. It's on Unsplash, royalty-free website. And if you do like my teaching, come join me on sketchloose.co.uk. I've got a completely free course you can join in with there. So the first thing we're going to do is have a little play with these watercolour pencils. They're actually Derwent Inktense pencils. So the pigment is made of ink. That means that when it settles and when it sort of dries out, it has a slightly different effect. But the actual process of using them is very similar to watercolour pencils. I like to use them here first because it means as we're sketching out our big shapes, we can make mistakes because we can wash them away. And that wash will form part of our very loose colours coming up. And with that, I suppose we should probably just start our sketching. And like I say, we're going to explore mixed media ideas today. We're going to look at this simple scene in many ways and make it loose, make it interesting, but keep somewhat of the essence of the scene. I'm starting with a red pencil, red watercolour Inktense pencil, and you can see just grabbing the shapes. You'll notice not very symmetrical on the two sides there. It's really common actually for people, and I include myself as people, to struggle to create shapes symmetrically in different sides. It's because you have to hold your hand very differently, and that's why sometimes a pencil can be an advantage. It just allows you that little bit of room to make even more errors than with your pen. And we all know how much I love errors with my pen anyway. The key though is not to overthink it. So, right, I made a little error there. I'm not going to spend 5 minutes trying to make it perfect with my pencil. I can change it with my pen later. And that's what the idea is going to be with all of these things. You know, they're not going to be perfect, but I'm going to be able to change them with my pen later. I'm going to be able to move them a little bit or even a lot in some places. The minute for me that I spend forever doing a pencil sketch, then my inkwork becomes really boring because you end up thinking you have to follow exactly what's happened, and you're basically just tracing. You're not sort of being spontaneous. You're not being loose, fun, fast, interesting. That's what happens for me. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen for you. But what I am saying is if at the moment you spend ages sketching with your pencil before you get into your pen, just try and see what happens if you sketch less with your pencil or don't sketch with your pencil at all. I'm now using a blue pencil, as you can see. Blue and orange are opposite each other on the colour wheel. They are colours which will neutralise one another. Blue and red will to some degree therefore neutralise, depending on exactly where they are on the colour wheel, the exact hue. And the idea here is that I can use the blue and the red in places to make the line feel more neutral, and just the red or just the blue to make it feel warm or cool. Coolness will make it feel a bit more shadowy, as will neutral. Warmth will make it feel a bit closer, a bit lighter. And I'm using therefore the blue pencil to pick out slightly different things compared to what I picked out with the red. And you can see this whole sketch, frankly, it looks a bit childish, doesn't it? But that's fine because this is the underlying skeleton. It's supposed to be simple. What I want is for anyone who looks at this to feel really confident that they could sketch this scene. And on top of it, they could add funky colours, funky ink. The minute you've done a 2-hour pencil sketch, it's really scary to add things on top. So that's all I want to do, a really simple childlike sketch. Moving on, we add our pen on top. So I'm using today a TWSBI Diamond 580. It's got an extra fine nib and waterproof carbon black ink. And we're going to use the outlines, the skeleton that we've produced with our pencil. We're not going to exactly follow it, and I'm being careful to make my line not exactly follow it, to add in some texture, to move things around a little bit. Again, the minute it totally follows it, I know for me that at the end of the sketch, I won't be happy with it. It will feel too stilted, too boring. We're also adding in more details, like some of these kind of frame marks, not sure what to call them, but the kind of marks, the kind of structure of the door, just adding in. You can see it went pretty drastically wrong on the right, but it will look fine by the end. It's just a loose sketch, just a loose idea, and it's the colours and the whole thing together that is going to make the image. As we move around the walls, I'm again just adding a few loose brick marks. I'm adding in some textures, adding in some suggestions of shadow, for example, on this odd kind of, it looks like a plastic barrel, and maybe it's a wooden barrel painted with a lot of acrylic paint or something. And then we can link things up again through using these little brick marks. Moving around, just using, remember this terrible, horrible mistake I made at the beginning, that asymmetrical red line? Well, it looked better with the blue, and it probably looks a bit better now with the ink as well. And then moving around and continuing this loose looped line, joining things up, finding these big shapes I had before and turning them into little more textured shapes with my pen, trying to get elements of, for example, in this hanging basket, we've got elements of that wire work where we can join it up, make it more interesting than just an upside down bucket, which is what it would be tempting to make it into if we didn't sort of just want to add in that extra texture, that extra wobble all the time. The lamp is such a key feature here, but they're also blooming awkward. So they've got so many edges and often a little awkward bit of perspective going on. So it's taking my time there, trying to kind of just feel my way around getting the right feel. And again, not being too certain in it and not overdoing it, because if you overdo it and you get it wrong, it's really obvious. If it's loose and light and it's a bit wrong, it's fine. It just flows. It just feels okay, and we can always correct it later. My focus now on this hanging basket is to kind of match it to the one on the right, because we want it to feel connected. The other thing that I'm focusing on, again, you'll notice the number of sort of loose brick marks, random swirls and things I'm doing around with my pen. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because this is, as we said at the very beginning, quite an interesting photo, but it's not totally inspiring. A lot of the interest is in the different colours of the brick and the different shapes of the brick, and also actually that kind of symmetrical pattern to the bricks. And that's not something I'm going to be interested in sketching. It looks amazing. There are people who do absolutely amazing sort of watercolours with this kind of scene, and it's not unsketchable by any means, but it's not for me and my style. So I'm having to adapt to this and find ways of using what I use in my art, using my little scratchy, loopy, nonsensey marks to make myself feel happy with the sketch. So again, I would suggest with this kind of thing, pushing yourself, pushing your boundaries. Not a scene I would normally choose. I would normally choose something more zoomed out, perspective in it, lots of houses, lots of big shapes to pick on. Here we don't have any. We've got a couple of big shapes, and the rest is all kind of detail work, which I'm not always very comfortable with, because it takes time and it takes focus, which I frankly don't have. It's also, I think, great to recognise these things in yourself. So I recognise that my fun is going to be found not in the details, but there are ways that I can have fun with the details, and that is going to be working out my way of being a bit abstract with them, a bit silly, a bit loopy, scratching my pen around and just having a bit of fun. Going around here now using hatching. fairly neat hatching, trying to keep that hatching consistent in a few ways, so consistent in weight, consistent in direction, and consistent in the sort of length of the hatching as well. That makes the hatching hopefully fade into the distance. What we don't want is all those hatch marks to feel like even more detail marks, because when that happens, if your hatching overtakes your detail marks, your pen shapes, then it will suddenly feel incredibly busy and overworked. Our loose colours are the next step. So here, using vibrant colours, obviously we got this bright red door, so we're going to make a feature of that. But around that bright red door, we've also got oranges, we've got blues, we've got these green hanging baskets. Let's see, therefore, how we can use our colours to explore those ideas, but also explore our version of the scene. And now for the fun. This is my new palette. This is actually the first sketch I did with this new palette. I have a video about how I created this new palette. And it's not really about that, to be honest. The video is really about how you can create your own palette, or how you can adapt and update your palette if you're looking for new ideas for new colours. But with that, I updated my palette. You can check out that other video. I'll link it in the description below. But the long and the short is that I now have this brighter, bolder, more ecologically sensitive palette. And you can see these colours in action already. So I've used some Perylene Scarlet, a really lovely bold red, a little bit of quinacridone Coral, which is a bright, punchy pink, some graphite grey, very lovely neutral grey, and here's some quinacridone Sienna. So there are plenty of colours in this palette, which you will have seen me use a lot before. Of note, the quinacridone Sienna and Indigo, two of my absolute favourites, so versatile, work so well together. They are, of course, staying in my palette. I've also got the lavender in there, which I've been using a lot for the last few months, which adds an opaque, lovely touch to my blues. And this scene is a lot about the warmth. At least that's the initial impression for me. When you actually squint and look again, one of the interesting things is the bricks aren't that warm at all. The bricks are actually pretty neutral. They're pretty sort of sullen and greyed out, and that's probably because of the contrast against this bright red door and these punchy greens and the bright yellow white coming out of the light. But I feel that the colours here, for me, what I wanted to make it about was this fascinating sort of punchy warmth, and that suits again my style, how I enjoy sketching, how I enjoy painting, and it also suits this palette, which is not one made for being subtle, which is great. I've been wanting to adapt to that kind of thing quite a lot recently. There's plenty of subtlety one can have with this palette, I must say, but when I'm exploring it, I'm not going to start off trying to be subtle. I'm going to start off trying to make the colours sing and just see what happens and see how far I can push them, how much is too much, that kind of thing. The graphite grey is a very lovely colour here, and as I build these colours up, as I move around, all I'm trying to do is number one, make it look interesting. So I'm trying to take real things, the red door, the yellow orangeness to the light, and then I'm trying to see what else can I add in my style which will make this look interesting. And a big part of that is what can I leave blank. So leaving big areas blank, letting the colours pool and letting the watercolours flow down the page and sort of sing together, painting a lot of wet on wet, little marks, which you can see that little sort of purple grey just floating out underneath the lamp. And then using slightly thicker paint to create highlights and punchy areas of colour. So this is quite a thick bit of azo yellow, which is just touching in a few places and providing perhaps a little more balance of something different. And it's really as simple as that. It's just me experimenting and exploring and trying to have a bit of fun. The blue, hopefully, I'm using that in and around a few places, along with some of these purpley touches, bit of indigo, with the idea of providing a more neutral greyed out feel. You can see actually I was going for more neutral than what I've achieved there. That's quite a sort of almost quite a warm blue, isn't it? There's a big purplish tinge to it, and that is because this is a new palette. So I wanted it to be neutral, but I haven't got the kind of reflexes yet to just immediately grab the right colours out of my palette, create the right mix and use it. And that is part of the exploration of having some new colours to play with. Now, normally at this stage, I'd let things dry, but because we're playing with mixed media, we can actually come back in with our pencils and look at those pencils, how they provide an almost opaque line of really bold colour. And I can use them in a few places, either as colour on top of the reds or on top of the shadows. And really now I can build up more texture, I can build up specific details, I can build up value. Don't want to overdo this. This again is experimental, it'd be very easy to go totally wrong, and it is something I've done a fair bit in the past, but not with these exact pencils and never for a prolonged period of time. So there you go, a few touches just enhancing little details, little suggestions of brickwork, little suggestions of shadow, and now we can leave it, let it dry, and we'll come back, restructure it and see what we can make of this at the end. And now is where things get really interesting, really fun. We can come back and restructure with our pen. I've also got my Posca pens, I've got my Inktense watercolours, the pencils I was using at the very beginning. There's lots of things we can do to mix our media. Now the interesting thing about adding pencil on top, adding, if we added gouache, if we add acrylic Posca markers, things like this, all these other media are actually opaque. So when we pop them on top, they cover our watercolours. That means we get a really obvious sense of them there. So for me, it's really important to hold them back a little. If we go too far, we'll find we lose the magic that is in watercolours. But if we use them just enough, we'll get that punch, that brightness, which comes from opaque rather than transparent colours. So here we go. The normal restructuring process begins, again, just with my ink pen, coming back on top and finding some of those key shapes. Nothing clever about this tool, trying most of all to just find the key shapes, not overdo it, not put too much black ink on the page, nothing too bold. And I don't want this to become a cartoon. Cartoon feel, that illustrative flat feel, would happen if I went round and made all my lines big, flat and bold. There's nothing wrong with that. That is not a criticism of that style, but it is not a style that I seek to produce. So for me, I'm trying to avoid it. And sometimes actually the only way I find I can rescue something is by make it into a bit more of a cartoony style. But today we're going to try and avoid it. Next, I can bring out those opaque Poscas. So you can see the kind of little red touches coming in. And even though they're very faint, they're very, not faint, rather, they're very small. They're very, subtle in the sense they're a really fine line. They're also very obvious because they're opaque, because they're providing a real punch of colour. And it's the same with the blues. And I'm trying here to provide highlights which complement what's on the page. And I mean complement in the sense of work with. So the blues are complementing the shadows, the reds are complementing the warm areas. This white, it's not a Posca pen, this is a different kind of marker made by Tombow, I believe, is providing highlights which add a bit of sort of reflection to some of the more dark areas, or perhaps where there are supposed to be little white flowers. And these tiny opaque touches, they sit on the top of our paper, they sit in front of our line, they sit in front of our colour, and they're super obvious. So we need to be careful not to overdo things, unless you're confident, unless you use a lot and you really know how far you can push things. So that's why I'm doing a few lines with the red, a few with the blue. Now using a different blue, a sort of sky blue, a light blue, doing just a few little touches with that. The other thing I really love about these is they provide a texture because they sit on top. They literally do. They sit on top as a almost 3D line. It adds something extra for me to the painting. You can't see that as much, unfortunately, on the camera, on the video. But in person, these Posca lines are obvious and that can be a good thing or a bad thing, but you know, if we use them right, it can definitely be a really wonderful, good thing. Here you can see having a bit of problem with my pen. The reason is that some of the page is still wet, and with a fountain pen, if it touches wet paper, that will sort of leach out the water from within it. All I'm trying to do is make some of these brick marks a little bolder, to again provide within a scene which has got only a few shapes. I'm having to think outside the box of how I can put my ink marks on the page, how I can make this my art rather than doing a not very good version of someone else's art. And so creating boldness around some of the brick marks was a way I thought, well, actually, I think that will work. And for me, actually, it did work. The other thing I thought was, instead of doing fish and chips or doing text at the top, I might try and draw a really loose fish and a little sort of selection of chips. Now, the fish kind of half came out like I was hoping for. The chips don't look like anything at all, do they? You might have noticed I practice at the bottom of the page with the fish in an area which I can chop this off. When I tend to put a lot of things up on Etsy, or I like to frame a lot of things. And what I do on these bigger pieces of paper is I chop off some of the surround, where I might have tested colours, or I might have tested little scribbles. So I can chop that little scribble off if it doesn't work. It might actually work with the picture, we'll see. We'll see how things go at the end. And finally, last but certainly not least, we can actually come back in with a few more watercolours. Now remember, I made some of those bricks a little bolder. Great, we can use those new marks to hold a bit of extra paint and to get a little extra kind of feeling of 3D-ness to it. These little extra bits of paint will sit similar to the opaque paint. They'll sit on front because they're darker, because of the layering effect of watercolours. And the layering effect also lets us enhance some of those shadows and kind of pair up where we've made some lovely highlights with our other pens. This is all just with all watercolours. It's an iterative process, step by step. You do things, you react to those things. The key is to recognise when you're out of ideas, or when your ideas perhaps aren't going to help your painting. And that is the point I've got to now. So with that, I'm going to simply end my sketching. And there you go, all done. If you enjoyed that, do like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what's your favourite mixed media to add to your watercolours, or is all mixed media a sin and something to be steered clear of? Join me on Sketch Loose if you like. Subscribe here for more free tutorials, and you can find various links down below to find more of my content, more of my tutorials, more of my teaching. Happy sketching! So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.